Today, Rob and I are going to be going through a pretty topical subject today. Will COVID-19 alter the landscape of employer-employee relationships and change the rules on IC classifications? Really, what we're going to talk about today is the new pressures and changes that have happened in the last couple of months, in the context of what had been a larger trend of the last year or so of changes to the way states were covering misclassification. So let's talk a little bit about what we'll try to get covered today. So we'll look at the current employment climate and some of the new trends. We'll look at how past and current trends may be a catalyst to a new quasi-IC classification. We'll talk about sweeping employment and life sustainability concerns caused by AB5 in California and other states' ABC tests, the need for businesses to help get people back to work without fear of litigation, and how to safely leverage IC talent in this new normal. So let's start with some trends and sort of what's happening in the world today. So look, there's no way to sugarcoat this. The unemployment is spectacularly bad. The last time it was anywhere near this number was at the peak of the Great Depression in 1933, when it hit nearly 25%. We're not there, at least not the official numbers, but you can see how much deeper the trough is today than it was in the 07 through 09 period and in the post.com period, both of which were staggeringly bad economies. The Fed today spoke about the shape of the trough and their assumption that while it won't be the incredibly optimistic V-shaped recession that would result in a boom at the end of the year, it's more likely to be a 12 to 14 month one. But looking at real change and trends upward in 2021, it doesn't make the next 12 months any easier to withstand. So in that context, let's talk about what was happening right before COVID and what's happening right now. So we've been talking about contingent labor and gig workers for the better part of 2 years during the HCI series. Prior to COVID, there were over 53 million gig economy workers in the US. It was an enormous part of the economy. Everyone knew someone doing this. And it was a choice that folks had made, right? If you look at the middle top there, percentage of freelancers surveyed who said there's no amount of money where I would take a traditional job, 51%. That's a big number. And people were optimistic about what was happening. And then we got hit in the face with the shovel. And what changed was significant. We saw this morning additional layoffs at Uber, reflective of changes to the gig economy. But there's been some positive stuff too. Working from home has become the new normal. Solutions like Zoom and GoToMeeting have allowed firms to do that. The trend is going to continue, it looks like, even after the outbreak, with folks realizing how much money they can save. And the early data says that as companies ramp back up, that we'd be looking at a change in the percentage of contingent workers versus full-time workers. The best estimates prior to COVID were something like 23% of corporate workers were contingent. That number looks like it's going up quite a bit. So we're seeing some changes. Some folks might consider those good or bad, but they do provide the context for the next set of data that we want to share with you. It's been good for some companies. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, Neil, I'll go ahead and jump in here. And just to wrap up too on the previous two slides. So, on the unemployment slide, what we're expecting there, as we've seen before during these sort of boom and bust times, is that the contingent workforce tends to grow or expand, after a situation of high unemployment. So that's one thing to think of there. That leads into the next slide too, just as Neil was saying, that the gig economy wasn't slowing down pre-COVID, and the expectation is that it's while it's slowing down during this pandemic, contingent workforce is still going to be very much in companies' plans, and we should expect that the use of freelancers and ICs should continue. One thing that we're going to get across here, you can see a little bit of on these slides, you'll see in other slides, is that while the contingent workforce is expected to grow, what that's going to look like and how they're going to be engaged in certain, whether they're going to get benefits, the model between IC or the distance between an independent contractor and employee may change a little. And so you're seeing that even with this remote workforce. Typically an independent contractor is always going to be remote or generally going to be off-site, not on the premises. Well, now employees are kind of, that's the way that is too. There's a cost savings associated with having people work remote. There's a cost savings associated with using independent contractors. So what you're going to see in some of these slides is now more than ever, sort of that line, that dividing line between an independent contractor and an IC is going to be a little more blurry, and maybe that's not altogether a bad thing. All right, so if you go to the next slide, as Neil was saying, you're seeing the pivot happen. Companies that supply independent contractors, contingent workforce to other companies and users reported revenue growth in their first quarter. Fiverr, Upwork, Citrix. Now, of course, we haven't seen the second quarter. We expect that will be, may not show these kind of growth patterns. But still, the expectation is that it will come back to growing towards contingent workforce, at least relative to typical, full-time employment hiring. So when we do come out of this, what are some things we might see in just kind of really high level? Well, we know what's going on right now. Businesses are under extreme pressure right now to create lean operating models and cut costs during this time. We don't know how long that recovery time is going to be. Neil's mentioned a few things on how it's going to look, the trough versus the V, right? But no one knows for sure how that's going to go. The length of the recession, again, this may make companies, it seems like it is making companies hesitant to add full-time employment jobs, but work still needs to be done. So how is that going to get done? Well, it doesn't take, much to show that would probably be a lean towards using contingent, non-full-time employee type of labor. But I think coming out of this, one thing that's really important to recognize in your strategy for hiring and engaging is what are employees or potential freelancers, what are they looking for too? So, we've got a lot of what we know what companies need to do. They need to get lean and they need to still get work done, and perhaps they need to pivot in their business objectives to match what's going on in the times. But we're also seeing sort of on the right side in that bubble there from a Gallup poll that employees are looking for, you could say perhaps, companies they can believe in. Half of employed Americans said they consider changing jobs during the pandemic to work for a company that's actively making a difference. 62% said they considered changing jobs during the pandemic if they felt their company was not doing enough to protect their employees. So, what you might have expected to see is, with such high rates of unemployment right now, that any job is a good job, any job is a job you've got to get. But what we're finding, though, is that employees still want certain things. They want to see that their companies are forward thinking. They want to see that their companies are looking to maybe make a difference during this time, and certainly looking to protect them from any kind of risk of contracting the virus. And so we're seeing that, that happening too. I'm mentioning a lot about employees. We talk mainly about independent contractors. I'm using them both during this talk because, today's employee could be tomorrow's independent contractor, and frankly, vice versa. And again, with a lot of the changes that we're seeing, as I said, that line is getting blurrier. So it's important when you're thinking about strategy for hiring that you're thinking, does an employee look like it typically looks like? Does an independent contractor look like it looked like before the pandemic? And then thinking about, how to go forward. Further to that, you've got the CARES Act, which, for the first time is applied. Independent contractors can apply for unemployment benefits. Unemployment benefits, obviously, typically something just for employees. This is one of the ways that companies got audited in the past. If they provided benefits that look like employee-type benefits to their independent contractors, that was a huge red flag, meaning you were going to have to pay back taxes and penalties. Well, obviously, the extreme conditions of today require, extreme measures. So things have changed. But we do see, again, when it's become necessary, we're providing some of these safety net benefits that we would never really have provided. previously to independent contractors. And that's not all. There's more coming with the HEROES Act as well. We're not sure where that's all gonna go. But one question to be asking yourself is, once we start providing these benefits, and they're temporary, do we just go back? Will we just be able to go back to, again, independent contractors far over here, employees far over here, and never the twain shall meet? Or are we going to be able to do that at all?
So, Rob, just in your opinion, what's your best guess?
Well, I think there's two things, Neil. It's my best guess, and it's what I think would be most appropriate. If we're saying my best guess, I think short term things would just try to be pulled back. But whether that's going to really be a tenable solution, in other words, we just turn the faucet off for independent contractors, really, it's at what point are the independent contractors in a better position or no better off than they would have been without these? And so I think then the conversation doesn't end around what we need to provide for independent contractors. What I think may happen or perhaps should happen, depending on your company, is when these kind of benefits end and you still want to be the engaging party of choice for independent contractors, that scarce talent, do you consider providing some of these employee type benefits to attract that talent? Is that going to be something that so where's your risk tolerance coming out of this pandemic?
Right. We're already seeing some of progressive companies are paying what for all intents and purposes is bench time to independent contractors, where they, rather than lose the talent permanently in a slowdown, they're paying them less to keep them warm. We've seen that across multiple different customers.
That's right. And while it's this is the thing that it's the best time now for companies to be able to do that, because who would you really think at this point, Neil, that even the IRS auditing organizations are going to be going over companies who are looking to do the right things for independent contractors who need social safety net benefits? No, probably not. But once the year ends and sort of the CARES Act is up and all that, then you're not under that sort of protection from the federal government. So now what do you do? The workers may still want some of those benefits. Are you going to be willing to provide them, or is shop B going to be willing to provide them and then attract that talent?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting time. As just a little history thing, as the Second World War ended and the boom in '49 started, the race to attract workers developed things like employee provided benefits. For medical benefits, and really created much of the modern 20th century. All right, Alan, we can go to the poll, I think.
Absolutely, that's fascinating stuff. Yeah, I definitely enjoy some of that history about how the modern kind of working arrangement came to be. So, if you take a look, HCI members, to the right of your screen, most of you may know the drill already, but we've got an audience poll coming up. So I'm going to give you all a minute to respond to that before we start showing results. But as you can see here, the question centers around your plans to reopen or resume something resembling a normal kind of operation. And what do you foresee when you look into the future at that kind of scenario? Is there going to be full-time remote situations offered for everybody working for you, partial in office and at home, or everybody going to be back in the office, business as usual, or you just don't know? So with that, I'm going to take a look at the results right now and see what we've got. Okay, guys.
They all agree.
yeah, absolutely. So what do you all think of that?
I think it's reflective of reality. As the governors currently start reopening, you're starting to hear them use that kind of language, right? Yesterday, Governor Polis of Colorado said he thinks it's likely schools will open in the fall, but it won't be all in class. It'll be a hybrid model of at home and in class. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm guessing, sort of large, dense schools like big high schools will be sort of, I'm a Tuesday, Thursday guy, and you're a Monday, Wednesday, Friday person. So we'll see how it plays out. But I think the most likely scenario is nobody's going to object if you don't want to come into the office that day.
Right. It'll be
Well,
very, very.
Neil,
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Neil, that's as an working from home sort of parent and teacher, that's fearsome news for me, because I can tell you one of the greatest challenges is having kids at home and sort of trying to put that hat on as a teacher. So, but yeah, so Neil, I would agree. So the new normal is going to be reflective of now, right? And so
Yep.
things will be open to some extent, but I mean, will workplaces be 3 days a week for this group, 2 days a week for that group? And what I would like to know too is what are some of we know the main driving forces are obviously the coronavirus. But we mentioned some other things too. When companies are talking about this, I'd like to know is some of the strategy to look, hey, there's a cost savings in realizing that we can realize by doing this as well. So overall, that would be interesting for me to know. Yes, during this time we have to offer that, but as a go forward, what are some of the things that went into that high percentage and offering in office and at home?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Look, and I think there's that. I think there's also, honestly, geographical considerations. I think parts of the country are going to continue to be hit harder than other parts of the country, and they're just going to have different responses.
Yeah, I think that's it's a big country. The climate is different. The population density is way different depending on where you are. So it's a very it's definitely a state by state or even city by city kind of decision.
Yeah,
right.
And what you do, right? Like if you make things, right? Like you're a manufacturer, that's just unrealistic to work from home. So
yeah, exactly.
Well, that was helpful. Confirmed some of the things we've been thinking, Rob.
Yeah. Definitely.
All right. Let's go back to the slides here and keep on rolling.
Yeah. And so, we're talking about what do we think is happening now? What do we think may happen after? One thing I could tell you is going to happen after the increase in legislation around worker misclassification is still going to be ongoing. We'll start with really the flashpoint of legislation, at least over the past couple of years. And this is the ABC test. So the ABC test, you probably know, Neil and I have gone on these and spoken about it over the past couple of years. This is a test that California adopted. It went into effect at the beginning of this year. It's a 3-prong test. It's extremely hard to pass if you're a company trying to prove that your engagement of an IC is compliant. And the reason it's really hard to pass is because of that prong being in the middle, and that's that the independent contractor is performing work that is outside of your company's usual course of business. Really tough to pass, because what is your usual course? You could say Ford Motors makes, automotive, products, things like that. But we don't really know how that prong B is going to be interpreted. Shorthand for our company, we've looked to Massachusetts, which also has the same version of this test, and we find that your ordinary course of business could even be just things you do often, but not really what you're well known for. So very tough test to pass. And bring this up because a lot's going to flow from this. A lot of other states are considering this ABC test. So it's sort of like looking at preparing for the worst, to make sure that you're on top of things. So that's just a quick refresher on the ABC test. So, there's a lot of people have said, look, I mean, right now we need people working, right? People just need to be working. It really doesn't matter. Let's set aside this whole misclassification issue. It just isn't happening, though. You can see on this slide that there's been an open letter to the governor in California to say, put AB5 aside. Let's let people work. You've got pro AB5 voices on the other side saying, yes, but under this law, a lot of these workers will get the benefits that they need, that they don't have. So, leave AB5 intact. I was just reading that Governor Newsom here in California, in his proposed budget, and I think there's a $54 billion deficit for next year in California, but his proposed budget still has about $20 million in AB5 enforcement earmarked for it. That sets off a bit of a firestorm here, but it tells you that enforcement, and we're talking about California, but as you're going to see, enforcement overall across the country for worker misclassification, that is going to be part of the post-pandemic landscape.
It's interesting, Rob. The articles associated with DoorDash and those other kind of gig companies, the stories at Uber and Lyft, they're kind of shining a light on the fragility of their business models, which was acquire market share at the expense of profits, and it's shining a light on the backs of folks who don't pay very much, which was AB5's original goal. But I think I think the position I would carve off is, but it was an overreach when it included, professionals who didn't need the help and medical professionals who had traditionally worked in that environment and in that style. Any comment on that?
I think you're right. It's a law of unintended consequences, Neil. And part of this is when you've got these two worker classifications that we've had. You mentioned historically, you look like the historical aspect of some of this. We've had W-2 employee or independent contractor 1099 worker since the New Deal. And then look where we are. Did the New Deal, did they sort of predict the marketplace that's come along to the innovation of the Ubers and the DoorDashes and all that? So when you're only working with this and you're passing laws with just this two classification regime, as you say, the unintended consequences kind of overtake the good in those laws too, by sweeping in more people than they should be, right? Over inclusive.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. All right. On the next slide here, this is just for the year. So, January 1st, California's AB5 went into effect. Shockingly, New York, the governor said we need to be tougher on worker misclassification than California, if you could believe that. So what does that mean? It's a little bit frightening if you're a business trying to understand how you can safely and compliantly use this workforce. You've got to. I'll interject that people who say we're just not using them at all are going to miss out on a lot of the reasons why people use them: access to scarce talent, cost savings, flexibility, and all that. January 20th, New Jersey has its own slate of laws on worker misclassifications went into effect. But Virginia has got a few laws going into effect, and they're going into effect in July. So I mentioned Virginia because, February 4th, those laws were pushed through, right sort of pre-pandemic outbreak and everything else. I've read nothing where these laws are going to be set aside, for the greater good or because, of the pandemic or because people need jobs. These laws are going to go into effect, about 4 laws on worker misclassification. And then you'll see a couple of the other things. But if you think that sort of enforcement is going away, you can see that even just 2 weeks ago, California brought a huge lawsuit against Uber and Lyft using AB5. So enforcement is still there. It makes sense if you think about it. Right now, it's sort of low-hanging fruit. I think it always has been. But, the Fed, states, they need to fill their coffers, tax revenue. And the whole thing about worker misclassification is it's out there because there's a huge tax gap when people misclassify workers, right? Underreporting of taxes and all these things. So enforcement's still there. I would say it's going to be part of your go forward, of your future, something that you've got to take into account. And just briefly, New York City, you're seeing. So what we don't have is at the federal level, there's never been one rule to rule them all. There hasn't been a federal law passed. There are always attempts. There's currently an attempt to codify ABC as the federal law. It's not predicted to pass, not going to pass. Okay, and that's what usually happens at the federal level. State level, you see different tests being adopted, different task forces being enacted, like in Michigan and Wisconsin, to crack down on worker classification. But in New York City, you're even seeing at the city level harsh laws being passed. A lot of our clients do business. A lot of obviously in New York City. New York City has just passed this right now. I think it was last week, went into effect, which does codify the ABC test inside the city as the test. So again, that hard B prong that I was mentioning before, that's now there in New York City. So if you want to classify properly, you've got to use the ABC test. And that's not all. There are, I think, about 4 other states that are looking that have laws out there in process to enact the ABC testing. It's Rhode Island, Washington State, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. So these ones, it's moving forward towards ABC. New Jersey just narrowly pulled the ABC test, the California's version of the ABC test, off the table, but that's not completely off the table. So we're seeing states and even cities taking sort of harsher stances on misclassification than at the federal level. Which brings us to, if it couldn't be more confusing, brings us to this slide. Would the Mandalorian be considered an employee under California's misclassification test? This is an article by a law firm, and we didn't make this one up. But where, if anybody watches The Mandalorian, Neil, I know you watch The Mandalorian, right?
I do watch
The Mandalorian. If you got Disney Plus, okay, yeah, great show.
That's why I have Disney Plus.
But it's why, I think that's why a lot of us have Disney Plus. I've got kids. I don't know how many times I can watch The Little Mermaid, right? But The Mandalorian at least is out there for me. So, this article is generally saying the three prongs, under the three prongs of the ABC test, would the Mandalorian, be considered an employer or an independent contractor? I think, Neil, because you're such an aficionado, I'll kind of run this past you. So
Sure.
The first prong of the ABC test is the Mandalorian free from control of his engaging entity? So I'll toss that to you for your thoughts.
So, as you might recall from the story, and I hope we don't get into inside baseball here, but he's given a task, but not told how to conduct the task. So I would think he passed the A prong.
Check. Got it. And then just skip to C, the other one. Does the Mandalorian have an independently established business as a bounty hunter, such that he should get a 1099 at the end of the year?
Well, so this gets a little grayer for me because, yes, he does, but it's sort of granted to him by the guild themselves. So then it becomes a question.
The bounty hunter guild.
Yeah. So I'll call it a yes, but I'll call it a gray yes.
Okay. And then finally, the dreaded B prong for the Mandalorian. Is his bounty hunting role outside of what the Bounty Hunters Guild does as their normal course of business? I mean, it is named the Bounty Hunters Guild.
So, depends on your timeline. So, up until I think it's the end of episode 2, he's absolutely inside the normal course of business of the guild. That is, he's been tasked to go kill the Baby Yoda, and he does all the activities to go do that. He invades the facility where the Baby Yoda is kept, and he brings the Yoda back to the guild, or back to the client.
No spoilers here, Neil.
Yeah, well, that's true. Fair enough. That said, when he rescues said Baby Yoda, he is no longer operating under the normal course of business for the guild, and I would say he becomes an independent contractor at that moment.
Okay, so let's say so that's Neil making his best legal argument. I like it, and that's the kind of legal argument that companies need to make under this test. I'm going to say, because it's the Bounty Hunters Guild and he is a bounty hunter, that he fails on prong B under California, and you're going to have to give the Mandalorian a W-2 this year, and we'll see how it goes next year.
Rob, since he can't take off his helmet, how can he fill out the I-9?
It's never going to happen. Yeah, so that is definitely inside baseball. I mean, but the point is that it's really confusing. It's over-inclusive. Sometimes it could seem sort of arbitrary, but this is what we're dealing with, and this is what a lot of states are going to have to be dealing with. Okay, post-pandemic. So moving to the next slide, and thanks, Neil, for indulging me on that.
No problem.
So if you consider that you're stuck with these laws, even coming out of COVID-19 and what that new normal is going to look like, then just don't feel as stuck as maybe we did on The Mandalorian. Work with your law. It's not going away. So this is one thing that we've done. I think a lot of companies, firms have done who are in their space too, is take a look at that law and see how you can still engage with independent contract. It can be done. For example, for us, the one, I guess you could say, saving grace of this tough law, AB5, is that it does have carve-outs. Certain buckets that don't have to comply with AB5 under certain it's very complicated. It's complex. But the bottom line is that, we've been able to use this with our clients in California to apply some of these exceptions and move projects through safely, compliantly with AB5 as independent contractor, that if we were just thinking of the ABC test without these exceptions, we wouldn't have been able to move them through as ICs. So it's not really to pat ourselves on the back. It's to say that it can be done. It should be done. It's going to need to be done, as part of your new normal. So get to know your laws at the state level as well as the usual IRS stuff, or work with someone who can help you understand that, and then go forward and benefit from the use of what's going to be another growing contingent workforce. And this kind of ties it all together. So we've seen that the gray is even grayer. The CARES Act is giving unemployment benefits to non-employees. We're having employees work off-site, like we have independent contractors work off-site. As I said, the New Deal is where we got the W-2 and the independent contractor classification. We haven't had a third classification ever since then. Now is the time. All right. So, this is something that you could think of as a quasi-IC, something that's between a traditional independent contractor and a traditional employee. This could take, I don't have all the answers here, but I do have the question. I think it's a good time to ask. It could take many, many forms. But generally, our current two-class system, it just doesn't really reflect the times, does it? Maybe the last 20 years, 30 years. I think another unintended consequence is it confuses parties who want to comply. So you have a lot of companies, people burying their heads in the sand, just saying, well, I can't meet this. I don't know what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to hire these people. I'll engage with them. And I'm not even going to bother trying to find out if they're compliant because it's just too confusing. I can never comply. So we've seen countries, Canada has this version, the dependent contractor. The UK has done things. There's many other countries, Spain as well. It's been done. Some of them done better than others. But looking at a sort of in between classification as a new way to do business, particularly as we come out to the new normal, should be something that is a consideration now more than ever. And we may not get that at the federal level. So I leave this out here to say, companies can be looking, as I mentioned before, companies can be looking at how can I provide sort of this quasi-IC, and can I safely do that? Because what we do know, as I said, is that workers, employees, and independent contractors are going to be looking for companies sort of that they could believe in. And some of that may take the form of independent contractors looking for benefits that they weren't looking for before. So it could just become something that companies need to look at. What can I do inside my own organization to sort of craft a different look for independent contractors than we've had before? A lot to be said there, but certainly something to consider.
Rob, as this idea takes traction, if the feds won't go along with it, can states create this third class without cooperation from the IRS and the DOL?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, we've seen that states are able to obviously have their own laws with the ABC test, independent of what the federal, of what the Fed, weighs in. They're not weighing in on it. So, but it's not just a government that this would come from too, Neil. I mean, what we're thinking, look at what some businesses are doing. I mean, you do have on-demand businesses that have, for the last year, been sort of dabbling in this by paying into pension funds, or providing paying into third-party health care providers for some of their freelancers, right? So we're seeing this kind of thing been happening and evolving. So it isn't just at the government level, and perhaps it really, doesn't need to be, but certainly at the business level. Depending on your use of independent contractors, it could be something as simple as providing, which I think a lot of companies do, providing information on how independent contractors can get health benefits. It's just that under these strict sort of previous tests for independent contracting, companies haven't wanted to do anything that might look like we're doing anything around employment with an independent contractor. Well, I don't think that that's going to be sort of sustainable to avoid those kind of things going forward. Yep.
And we've seen some customers providing professional liability insurance to their contractors as well. So let's talk about what is next. So I'm going to present a little bit of a few stats here, and then talk about what companies can do to sort of prepare themselves for the inevitability of the end of the COVID crisis. So, just like before COVID, the future of work is worker centric. It shined the COVID crisis shined a bright light on working remotely, and all those things that are associated with that. But really, the trends that we saw before were all underlying and there. Some things we learned. Some folks can work well from home and enjoy it. Some folks don't. Small businesses HR function was really not prepared for the COVID crisis, but that they're catching up quickly. Benefits have been modified, and so on. And then, as Rob was talking about, in terms of what can private companies do, Upwork provided $25,000 grants to small businesses to accelerate projects and or mitigate the loss of revenue here, which has been it's an interesting strategy. It certainly came right back to them. Rob, you want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I just think the takeaway from some of this too is that now more than ever, so that your practices and your optics need to align. The workforce is out there looking to see what companies are doing to give back and what companies are doing to protect those who work for them. So it's how things look, and what you can do to be out there, like Upwork, providing something. And as Neil said, that basically comes back to them. But still, it looks really good, and it is a good thing to do, right?
Yep, absolutely. But it can't come at the expense of not having compliance in general. So let's talk about that just briefly. Look, companies still and in the future, for foreseeable future, have to categorize and classify workers appropriately. Who's a contractor, who's a temp, who's an IC, who's a full-time employee, who's an outside service provider. Those are important distinctions in the way you manage your folks. No solution is perfect. So auditing your data to ensure that you're doing that the gates you've put in place are working. Partner with folks like TalentWave to perform an audit or to manage your ICs, and make sure that you remain in compliance. Note that changes in legislation happen and sometimes are retroactive. So keeping an eye on what's happening in the various states is important. And to develop a program, an action plan that is robust enough to satisfy the sort of compliance needs, without being so egregious that you can no longer engage an IC. And to that end, a talent acquisition, talent attraction is still paramount in smart companies. And so it's important that you make a program that is both attractive to the contractor, that is, you become the contract of choice in the marketplace, but also protects the company from the risks of worker misclassification. Your talent strategy should include all of the categories of workers that I just mentioned. It's not all FTEs. It's not no FTEs. And it looks like, as the trend has continued, that the percentage of non-full-time workers and more non-employee workers is going to be the new norm. And leadership matters. That's Rob. You want to add on to that or no?
No, I think you got it, Neil. Just to say that as things are changing, as it says, go ahead and confront that worker misclassification, because you can tell by those legislative trends that's one thing that's definitely not changing there.
Cool. And now I'll turn it back to Alan for any questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys, for putting that together. And just on the Mandalorian note, I do look forward to Carl Weathers being named in that lawsuit.
That's right.
So we have another fan.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of questions coming in, but I will remind everybody who's listening and watching that the way to ask those questions is just follow that purple arrow on your screen and look in the Q&A box below. You can ask any question you have of our presenters right now. So here we go. Looking at this question from Zena, it's really more of a COVID-related question, but Zena has a question thinking about the recommendations for those employees who are currently working from home during the pandemic due to health issues. Maybe they've got a compromised immune system, something like that. How do you recommend employers try and handle that more delicate situation when loosening things up and maybe bringing more people back into the office or back into the factory? What do you think employers should be thinking through when they do that?
I'll start with, we are absolutely not experts on public health, but
Yes.
I'll just give you the simple example of what we're doing. If you have to go back into the office, which nobody has to yet, but in the future, if you have to go back in the office, we've sort of set up pathways where you'll never crisscross another person within the office. Obviously, personal protection equipment, sterilizing masks and so on, and wipes are being provided or will have been provided. But I don't think there's a great answer to it at all. I think it depends on the individual circumstance, and if one's personal health would prevent or provide enough fear that you don't want to go in, I think smart employers will be remembered for allowing them to continue to work from home.
Neil, I think I'd agree with you on that.
Yeah, definitely more of a case by case. So the another one that we've got here is from Rachel, and Rachel's asking, is there any data on what kind of cost savings employers might see if they use contractors instead of full-time employees to do certain types of work?
Yeah, the staffing industry maintains data on the cost of a contractor versus the cost of a full-time employee. The savings is generally derived from a couple of things. One is the company doesn't provide, the client company doesn't provide benefits and other ancillary costs that are associated with it. Generally speaking, companies only pay for the hours that somebody works, so it's easy to ratchet up and down and therefore create cost savings. And finally, every company in America, full-time workers, generally speaking, creep their sort of annual raises over time tend to creep them above market rates for the same position, which creates imbalance in the marketplace. You can argue that's a good thing or not, but it is sort of factual. Rob, you have any more?
Yeah, well, I mean, generally speaking, I think you're saving about 30% per head when you use an independent contractor versus an employee.
Yeah, and so those are all good points. Another thing, this one is also from Rachel. She asked, has the ABC test always been there, or is it new?
Right. Well, in California, it's new. In Massachusetts, it's been there for about 15 or 16 years. Other states do use it, but not as there's two things, not as their sort of prevailing test. They might use it on certain agency levels. And then other states have versions of the ABC test that have a more permissive prong B, such as New Jersey currently. And that means you have two ways to satisfy the dreaded prong B. It's either they don't do things that are inside of your ordinary course of business, or they don't do anything on site. So that would be that's kind of the second way you can satisfy it in those states.
Great. This question is from Jeffrey, and he wants to know, what will the trend of shifting to non-employee labor have on the average company's compliance policies?
Well, that's an expansive question. So the shift towards non-employee labor performing work in general require, like, worker classification is one thing. Compliance with worker classification is one thing. Compliance with general policy becomes a much bigger deal when, say, 30% of your workers aren't your employees. So you have procurement compliance, you have worker categorization compliance, and worker classification compliance, all of which simply get bigger because there's more of them.
Right. Anything to add there, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, it's kind of what are your policies currently, and then taking a look at those to see what they should be in the future, going forward. There's certainly a lot more, I think, to comply with. And, sometimes what we find is some of the policies that are there, they could be as old as the New Deal. They've been there a long time. Nobody's really looked at this stuff. Nobody's really updated this stuff. So it's times like this, once we all have a handle to have the space to do it, or to work with somebody who can help, where all the policies as well as classifications, independent contractor agreements should be reviewed to see, what in fact they do say. Are your practices reflective of what's on your paper, and then what updates need to be made?
Yeah, this next one comes from Meredith, and she says, you highlighted recent legislation at the state level for worker classification. Do you think more states are going to follow? And will there even be a federal initiative to have sort of one law of the land, especially after the CARES Act?
Yeah, there was there is a federal initiative, a federal law out there, which I think it passed the Assembly. Is not going to pass it, but it won't pass the Senate. It's not. So, and that was looking to put the ABC test. Part of it was the ABC test. I think it's called a PRO Act, a Protect Right to Organize Act. It would have brought the ABC test, at the federal level. So that one law that's out there, which we haven't had, but again, not likely to pass at all. So that's not going to happen. At the state level, it is happening. Some of the states I highlighted that are looking at this are Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Washington State, New Jersey. So there are a lot of states that are looking to do what California has done with the ABC test. So I would expect it to be out there. When the ABC test, first came out, it kind of was easy to say this is California, sort of outside the box and sort of extreme, and maybe this isn't going to, but that hasn't been the case. It has sort of, California does have a big influence on other states. And so we should expect the ABC test to be in more states.
Neil, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think Rob's right. I think a federal law is unlikely. And I think the states are going to have to manage this on their own. Where it's going to be interesting is jurisdictional effect, right? So if the worker's in California but performing work for Texas, that Texas company is going to have to figure out how to manage California compliance.
Yeah, it's an interesting wrinkle in all of that, isn't it? We've got some more time here, so I'm going to keep reading these as they come through. Another question we got is, my company doesn't use independent contractors regularly. If this is, but if this is a new trend and kind of the way things are going, what's the single biggest risk an employer has in using independent contractors, and how do we steer clear of that?
So, Rob, start with compliance, but I've got a different perspective I'd like to share.
Sure. Yeah, sure. From compliance, worker misclassification, still worker misclassification. That's your single biggest risk. Steering clear of it is, some of the things that are in here is you gotta vet. You gotta find out if you're compliantly using your independent contractors, per something. So, a lot of companies are still just papering these up with an independent contractor agreement, but you got to go a little further. Certainly there's a lot of different layers, but you can look at the business setup of the worker, make sure they have a business and they don't look like your employee. And then, of course, from a direction and control perspective, you should just be giving your independent contractors the goals and the scope, telling them what to do, and then they should have the sort of independence to go out and do that. So, yeah. So
another perspective to take, and the question was asked from what's my biggest risk in engaging independent contractors. I think, based on that leadership slide that we ended the presentation with, one should start with what's my biggest risk in not using independent contractors? And that risk starts with, am I actually accessing the right talent? Am I getting the experts that I need to maintain my competitive edge in what is going to be a very competitive marketplace, regardless of what industry you're in? Many companies take that risk, and they make it egregiously difficult to engage an independent contractor to the point where they can't engage them, practically can't. 100-page independent contractor agreements, really high insurance levels, 3 months to onboard the resource, and so on. And those are all just business prevention techniques that need to be mitigated. You got to balance risk and reward. It can't just be all about mitigating risk. Alan?
Oops, I'm sorry, I was on mute. We do have one more. We do have one more time for one more question. Apologies there. So, last question here is: with such high unemployment trends, will lawmakers be focusing more on getting people back to work rather than the worker misclassification enforcement?
Yeah, I think I could start there. The enforcement. We've shown it continues. It continues on. So I think it is still balancing. How do we get people back to work? But they're sort of different sectors looking at different things. So from the enforcement side of things, you've got that, and then you've got people looking at how to get people back to work. So it doesn't seem to me. I mean, if we take Virginia as a case example, that enforcement, getting worker misclassification laws in place, is slowing down or being set aside during this time.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think it's one of those "it depends" answers, right? I think from certain perspectives, getting people back to work takes a secondary seat to getting people back to work in a stable, healthy way. Certainly, we could deregulate employment, remove the minimum wage or whatever, and we'd have pretty high employment rates, but we'd also have pretty high poverty rates. So the concepts of balance is what really matters here.
Well, I think that's a pretty good note to go out on. So I want to thank you guys for putting together a great presentation. And I also want to remind all our HCI members that today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. Your credits for attending this webcast, just give us about 24 hours to get everything squared away with those organizations, and the credits will be available if you click on My HCI Dashboard up there in the top right-hand corner of your screen, then click on Learning and Download Transcript, and then you'll be able to get both sets of codes for your recertification efforts. And also, while you're there, make sure to check out hci.org as a whole for even more free content, as well as information on all of our certifications and events. So I'd like to say one more thank you to our presenters today and to the good people at TalentWave. And I'd also like to thank you, the webcast viewer. Thank you for spending an hour with us. We'll see you next time.